Hey guys, welcome to the World of Kylea YouTube channel. My name's Chase, and today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, that's sci-fi fantasy city creation. Today I'm going to be giving you guys a little bit of backstory about what makes good city design, my kind of process and thought process around how I create cities for the different projects we work on. And then at the end of the video, I'll do a little tutorial / show some behind the scenes content on how I made cities for our show. Anyway, I suck at intros, so let's get into it. Before I show you a little bit about my process on how I make cities, I want to give you guys the fundamentals to understand what makes good city design. I broke this up into 3 keys. The first one, follow the story. The second one, cinematic appeal. And the third one, design levels. The first step, know your story. Now, why is it super important to know your story before going into city design? There's 2 main reasons. Number 1, we have to know the tone that we're trying to set. And number 2, we have to know how our characters are going to get from point A to point B. A mistake I see a lot of beginning filmmakers make is they come up with these ideas for these incredible cities and these incredible designs, but they don't think about how their characters are going to actually traverse those spaces. So they end up creating way more than they actually need within the shot. And you have shots that have a bunch of motion blur and are super tight and zoomed in on one character, and we miss all of this incredible work we ended up doing. So we can actually save a ton of time and focus on what's actually important within the scene. Another important detail is that we need to know how our characters are actually going to get from point A to point B so that we can add obstacles in our character's way. This will add a lot of realism to our city as it makes it feel lived in, and it makes our characters feel like they have to actually go through a set of obstacles in order to get to their end goal. The second most important thing when designing a city is cinematic appeal. Now, I know that's kind of like a buzzword. A lot of people throw it around. Oh, how to make your shot cinematic and all that kind of stuff. But it is really important when designing a city to make it feel bigger than it actually is. One of the best ways to do this is adding a sense of scale. I like to add monolithic structures, which kind of suspend the person's disbelief as they're watching the film, that this character isn't just in an average temple or an average city. They're looking at these monolithic structures, and as they look up, they feel the same sense of wonder that we feel while we're watching the film. A great way to do this is by having hero shapes or hero buildings. These are objects within our scene that draw the eye and tell the audience that they're going to be super important later on, or they just add functionality to the scene, which makes it feel like the city is built around an individual building, object, or landmark. And then the last step of making something cinematic is that organized chaos, right? We want things to feel complex because that's what cities are. If you think about all the things that create a city, we're thinking about roads, we're thinking about pipes, buildings, bus routes, like everything that makes up a city is super complex. But when we look at it, we need to see that organization, right? We need to see that there's some flow of buildings from one to another and that people who live there would actually be able to traverse the city. Now, obviously, this could be done in a myriad of different ways and we could overdo it, but I'll show you some techniques later on how we can kind of give the illusion that there is kind of a sense of flow within the city. And last but not least, we have design levels. So this may be a term that you're not super familiar with. I like to talk about this in 3 steps. So you have your primary design levels. These are those hero buildings and even landscapes that I was talking about earlier. This is the blank form that if you silhouetted an image, you'd be able to kind of tell what everything was, and it makes up the bulk of what makes up a city. Then we have our secondary layer. These are our supporting buildings. These are things that kind of fade into the background. But again, add to that silhouette, add more design details. And then we have our last step, which is our tertiary. And those are that third level where we are adding greebles and different parts onto our scene that make it feel more lived in, and we're adding functionality to the form that we created in the first 2 steps. Well, those are the 3 keys I have for designing a city. Now let's jump into my process on how I create my cities for our show. And now for the fun part. Let's break down some of the shots in the film and talk about how I incorporated those 3 keys into the creation and eventual rendering of these shots. So here's the first one. This is kind of like the intro shot of the sequence. Seeing this just reminds me of how long this took me to model and animate and everything. But anyway, with this shot, I think one of the first things that we can look at is those design levels we just talked about. So we have these 2 kind of hero buildings that you can see. We have the main tower, which is kind of like this laser tower that exists in the center of the city. And then we also have this giant keyhole like style door that I knew I wanted to add from the very beginning. So as I created this city, I kind of used that as the blank canvas and silhouette to kind of create the rest of it around. If we look at the secondary details, we see this ring, which adds more complexity to the silhouette, as well as like more mystique to this kind of sci-fi fantasy floating, ring or whatever, as well as these buildings and watchtowers, which kind of exist on the outside of this river valley. And then that third level we talked about again is all of the little things you add, which make the scene feel way more lived in. So for example, here you can see I added a bunch of trees, palm trees, and like jungle kind of like forest trees to give that idea of like a desert oasis, as well as some like reeds down by the water. These are the least important, I guess you could say, in terms of like the overall silhouette. But when you look at the feeling of like, oh, there's this abandoned jungle kind of oasis city hidden in the mountains, I think they add a ton of character to the ending scene. Let's jump to shot number 2. This shot right here is a great example of following this story. So I knew the whole time that I was going to have them fly from the inside of the ring to the outside of the ring. But like I talked about earlier, I didn't exactly know one-to-one how they were going to get from point A to point B. So as I was kind of designing the city, I tested out some camera angles, and I came up with this shot idea where they would fly through a hole in the wall. And then naturally I was like, okay, if we have a hole in the wall, something has to have created that hole in the wall. And it kind of connected to the story I wanted for the city. So as I was designing it, I was able to add this like giant skeleton. And then naturally it's like, okay, 1 and 1 is 2. So let's have the spaceship fly through this like cool skeletal kind of system, which I think ended up in a really cool shot. And it adds to the world building as well as like kind of this sense of scale. Now, speaking of scale, let's move on to shot number 3. Okay, so to really sell the scale, this is one of the shots I thought I wanted to add really early. So as you can see, we kind of have this like big wide shot, and it's the first time we can really see how big the city that they're flying around is. On the far left, it's kind of little, kind of where my cursor is right now. You can see the keyhole that we traveled into, and then on the far right, you can see the monster kind of skeleton that we flew a second ago through. So you can kind of see how big the scene is, but then like I talked about, there is kind of like an organized chaos where in the way I laid out the city, even though most of it is covered in sand and moss and other things, and it's kind of decrepit because it's been, a long time since people have lived here, there at least is somewhat, I think, of a structure. We have these canals or like aqueducts that lead from the center building all the way out to the outer ring. We have this giant wall that protects the city, and like I talked about earlier, there being a hole in the wall helps even add to the story. As well as when I designed the city, I tried to kind of build it around these waterways and make it feel like there are like cultural centers, or people would like naturally, be in one region rather than the other. And then there'd be temples that people could go to, based on the location. So anyway, that's how I kind of incorporated those 3 things we talked about into the designing of the city, as well as the rendering of the city. And now you guys can see kind of like what the final looks like. And now I'm going to take you guys behind the scenes and show you how I actually created this within the 3D model. So let's go see that. Okay, so now we're in the actual Blender file that I used to create those scenes. And let's take a look. So as you can see right now, this is the original shot that I showed you. And the reason why I wanted to kind of take you into the Blender file is to show you what I talked about earlier in terms of creating a story and then creating a scene that fits that story. So for example, I knew that I was going to have this kind of like epic, pan up into this like cool shot of this hero building. So I specifically designed this tunnel in order to kind of create that atmosphere. So adding a bunch of leaves and different vines that kind of drape down over the scene, and then these like ancient statues, even having like the birds fly over, even like the little designs in the tunnel. Like this was all to kind of create that vibe. But one of the things you'll very quickly notice is that as soon as I zoom out, like things break down really, really quickly, right? While this is designed, and I kind of have some of the other design details muted right now, so that tertiary layer that I talked about is actually turned off. But you can really easily see that a lot of the scene is actually blank. So I kept the buildings so you can kind of see those pockets that I talked about earlier, and then this other green color is where the sand kind of took over. But you see these little lines right here? These are the paths that the ships took as they flew around the scene. And because I knew those angles, I could pre-viz basically, which is when you take a very janky early model and kind of block everything out and then watch it through and then design everything based on that kind of like previs model. But I could do something like that, and then that allowed me a lot of freedom in the way that I created things and made me be able to focus on details that I knew would end up in the shot rather than details that would be specifically hidden. So for example, does it make sense that, you know, this one area is so heavily detailed whereas there's like essentially nothing in this corner? Probably not, right? If we're dealing with a city, there's probably some utility out there, even if it's like super basic, like a park or any of that kind of stuff. There was probably something there, but because I knew I wasn't going to see it in the final shot, I could kind of design my scene around the idea that I knew what was going to be kind of in the final. So that's kind of the last tip I'll give in terms of design. And now I'm going to take you through a quick little tutorial on how we can use all of the tools and all the techniques I kind of just taught you and make our own city really quickly in Blender using some very basic techniques. So let's hop into it. Okay, we're going to try to do this in around 10 minutes. I think we can kind of knock this out in 10 minutes. So if you have Blender, again, you don't necessarily need Blender for this to work, but I just use Blender. It's a free program. It's absolutely phenomenal. For the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to try to keep it more along the basic sides, but we'll still kind of show you how fast you can create random details. So anyway, as always, we're going to delete everything in the scene and kind of start from a blank canvas. So the first thing we're going to do is look at our meshes. We're going to add a landscape. This is using the Ant landscape generator, which is a tool that you can activate in the plugins menu if you don't have it already. We're going to look for a large landscape. We can also change the random seed value, which will give us different variations. So we can kind of look and see which one we like. Let's say we like this one. We can just do S10, and now we have a scaled up shot like this. The first thing I like to do is kind of add some depth to the mountains. That's looking pretty good, and this will provide a pretty good scene for us to work with. Then we're going to add a plane, which later we're going to use as kind of like a water level. So as we raise this up just like that, you can kind of see that water level rise, and we can kind of play around with that. I'm going to actually increase the size of these mountains a little bit. We're kind of going for some sort of like city on a lake is what I'm kind of imagining. So we're going to kind of fly around. I have my add camera set to F1. So like I said earlier, we're going to just kind of fly around the scene and find a shot we like. As I said before, we want to know kind of what story we're going to tell before we hop in there. I kind of like something like this. I feel like looks pretty nice. We kind of have our foreground object, which we can use as this left side. We have our midground, which is where we're kind of build the city. And then we have the background, which is this like back kind of like far off plane. I'm also going to add a subdivision surface on top of this just to kind of smooth things out a little bit. Depending on how strong your computer is, this will kind of like vary, and you don't need, to always have it like live. My computer can handle it. Thank God. This thing is such an upgrade over my last computer. The other thing is we're going to come down here and change the in scale to about like 2,000 meters just to be safe. And then we're going to increase the start clip range to 0.1 so we get rid of that like artifacting that we had a little bit there. Now that we know, again, we have a base idea for our camera angle. We know we're going to have some design elements here. We're going to have some design elements in the midground, and then probably just like trees or maybe something in the background. We can kind of start thinking about our hero image or our hero model and what we're going to want to do. In this case, I think it could be pretty interesting if we went for like some sort of like Colossus of Rhodes kind of aesthetic. Obviously, for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm not going to build out like a specific statue, but we can use this handy dandy plugin at the top, which I have other tutorials on, which allow us to kind of grab things. So we're going to look up a statue, and we're going to find... Ooh, this one's pretty cool. I've used this one before. It's a pretty awesome statue. So shout out this plugin. I will link it probably in the description. It's a free plugin. It gives you a bunch of stuff that you can use, and models, textures, all that kind of stuff. It's absolutely phenomenal. Okay, so we're just going to kind of scale up this Buddha and put them potentially, let's move them back onto this kind of mountain back here. I think this is a good spot for them. We'll move them like right up here. We're going for like kind of that like Christ Redeemer kind of aesthetic, you know, like Buddha on the mountain watching over the people underneath or something like that. I think that's a good angle. We also get that kind of like direct line that leads from the left of the frame, which we'll kind of look at first in the foreground, up to this Buddha. Okay, so we're pretty far into this tutorial already, just like creating up this basic shape or whatever. So let's add those design details like I talked about before. So we have our hero, right? This is our hero structure. This is the main thing that we're going to build the scene around. And let's now add our secondary details. So we're going to create a couple of really basic buildings that we'll use for this blocking draft, and then we'll add the tertiary layer after. So we're going to add a new collection, and we're going to call this secondary buildings. And then we're going to move our starting point like way over here so that we don't, let's move it like right over here so that we don't go into anything. We're going to add a basic cube, and then we're just going to add a little bit of detail into this cube. That way it feels building-esque. Doesn't need to be too heavily designed. Even something just as basic as this looks like a little Lego piece will be fine. Then we will duplicate this, and we will just make some like subtle changes to it, right? Make it maybe like a little skinnier, a little fatter. We'll make another one, and we'll make this one slightly taller, and that will do us some good. And then we will add another one, and for this one will be more like a cylinder shape. Again, we don't have to go too crazy into the details. We're just trying to add some variety. I'm going to inset this and then extrude along normals to create kind of like an interesting shape there. And then we're going to snap all of these to the cursor. So we're going to go to cursor, and then we will collect all of these images on the side, and then we're going to set the origin of each one of these to that cursor. That way when we spawn things in, they spawn in at the right height, and that's incredibly important for the next kind of steps that we're going to have. So we're going to select all of these, and we're going to go select origin, and then go to 3D cursor. So now, as you can kind of tell now, the main spawning point is going to be at the base instead of at the top, which is going to be super helpful. So now that we have these like basic generic shapes, we're going to then place them into our scene. So the first thing we want to do is go to particle systems. We're going to add a particle system, but not an emitter. We're going to add a hair particle system, and we don't want it to be spawning like you can see all over everything. We want it to spawn specifically where we have stuff. So we're going to turn all of these field weights down. So let's weight paint our shot so that we can kind of tell where we want things. I like to go to the normal camera view. That way I can see things a little bit better. So I'm just going to weight paint with like, let's say 80% or something like that. And for now, we can just turn off this subdivision as well as the particle system so that things aren't like super complicated for our computer. But we're going to say like, okay, we want some buildings in this area, and maybe we want some buildings in this area, something like that. And then maybe there's some buildings back here. So we have enough buildings that will kind of add some density to this shot, but not too many that again, we're not going to need them in certain areas. So we're going to go back to object mode. We're going to turn back on our particle system, and then we're going to change the density to that group we just created. So now, as you can tell, we're only gaining the buildings where we added that weight paint a second ago. Then we're going to go to render, and rather than rendering a path, we're going to want to actually render our collection. And that collection is going to be that secondary building collection that we had earlier. But as you can tell right now, all of our buildings have fallen down, which is not super good. So we're going to want to go to our buildings. We're going to then apply our rotation. So we're going to go collect all of our buildings, R, X, and then -90. That will rotate all of our buildings on its side, which is a little bit weird in Blender. But once we apply this, we can actually use a really cool technique. So now you can see all of our buildings are actually facing upwards, which is how buildings are supposed to be. Rotating it on the random z-axis will kind of like make them a little bit weird. But you want to add a little bit of variation because that's how life works. You don't need to add a lot, so I'm adding like 0.03. But the actual tool that we want to use is our phase. So this will change how the buildings are kind of spun on that like z-axis, almost like in the 360 range. So we can randomize the phase, and maybe that 0.3 is a little bit high, so we're going to add like 0.19. Next, as obviously you can tell, all of our buildings are exactly the same size. So we actually want to change the scale. So we're going to come here and do scale randomness. We're going to add a lot of variation to this. And then maybe we're going to go from 1,000 to something like 2,000. Now when we look back through our shot, we're already seeing a lot of clarity within the frame. We're seeing a lot of small buildings, and then we're seeing a lot of tall buildings. This would be something that would be pretty good for us to kind of just like get the gist of it. And this is, again, a blocking draft, so it's not going to be the absolute final. But this is a good test. I think there's too much buildings, like there's too much similarity around the shot. So we can actually then go into our weight paint one more time, and we're going to change this weight down to something like 0.2. And then if you see, I'm going to paint that, and maybe even a little bit lower at like 0.08. And we're going to kind of carve away at some of these buildings that we had before, which will kind of change the amount that we have and the density of the buildings. So now that we've done that, I think that's looking pretty good. I think the only thing left is to change the scale. So I think I'm going to go down maybe to like 0.4 or something like that, and then change the randomness down to like 0.7. Which I think is feeling a little bit better. So now we have our secondary buildings, we have our primary building in the background, and now we just need to add our tertiary design stuff, which is going to be our trees and stuff like that. So again, we're going to use the same plugin. We're going to look for something relatively low poly, so maybe even low poly tree. This one is pretty good. I've actually used this one on another project. So this will give us a bunch of low poly trees. We can actually just delete that, and we only really need this one tree. We're going to go put it over by the buildings. Same thing, RX -90. Once we have it rotated, we'll bring it up a little bit. The scale is already, or the spawn point is already right, so we're going to keep that. And then we're going to just go and apply our rotation to this tree. Now that the rotation is applied, we're pretty good to go. Okay, again, let's go into our shot, and then we're going to look for the areas where we want the trees. First, we're going to go and click on this, and we're going to add a new vertex group, and we're going to name this one trees. One more time, we're going to come into the weight paint mode, and we're just going to paint in with like something around like an 85, all the areas that we want trees. So this will be all of our background. This will be our foreground. This will be kind of that like mid-ground area, rotating around into the background and then down a little bit in here. So something random like this will probably work for us. Again, you can never really go wrong with too many trees as long as your computer can handle it. Adding back into the other mode, we're going to go and look for another hair. And this will be, again, a collection. And that instance will be the low poly trees from before. We're going to want to crank this up to like as high as your computer can go. I'm just going to do like something like 5,000. And then for our vertex groups, we're going to just collect trees. As you can tell right now, again, a little janky. So we have to go into our scale, and we're going to add a scale of like, let's say something like 0.2 seems right. And then we have to add way more scale randomness. We're also going to add that rotation that we talked about earlier. So advanced, add that rotation. Go to global Z, and then we're going to add some randomness. This we can do much more variation in the kind of XY yaw, I guess, or whatever it's called. And then we're going to add some phase so that the plants aren't all facing the exact same way. Once we do this, we're going to go down and add a cheater kind of thing, which is going down to the children, and we're going to do interpolated, which will take what we have and then multiply it. So for example, right now we're doing display amount 10, but in the final render it'll be 100. I think that's probably a little bit too much in the final, so we're going to do something like 20, which I think seems kind of fair. Again, this is going to be dependent on how many your computer can do in the final. And then we're going to kind of marry those two steps. So then we have the primary layer, which again is our Buddha statue. We have the secondary layer, which is going to be the buildings that we design, and we have that third layer, which is the trees. So now looking at the scene, we've kind of created this shot, but now obviously we need the camera to kind of like move through the scene. So let us take away, and we're only going to look at maybe like 5 on the display, because again, we kind of get the vibes, we know what it looks like at the end, but this will be a little bit easier for our computer to move through. And then we're just going to animate our camera real quick. So we're going to just do this pretty cheap and dirty. So we're going to have our camera start maybe like something like, let's see. Let's have a reveal of our Buddha. So we'll start down here. This reminds me of that like classic, like, you know, when Hollywood does a shot of like the Hollywood Hills. And then we're going to push up and over and then see our kind of like Buddha statue. So something like this I think will be awesome. And then we're just going to change our interpolation down from Bezier, which I think is at default, up to linear, which will be a little bit better for the camera movement as we push over this hill. This feels a little bit slow, so we're just going to push that ending keyframe closer to like maybe like 110 might feel better. And then bada bing, bada boom, we've turned a blank canvas into kind of like a cinematic shot, which again, we're revealing. And this is a great example. We didn't know we needed trees as low as before. So what we can do is just go to weight paint, and we're just going to add some trees down here so that it is fleshed out a little bit more and feels a little bit more realistic. And there's not that like dead area. So going back into object mode, we can kind of look at the new scene. Everything is super procedural. And just like that, we've created a cinematic shot. Thank you for following along. Again, I'm going to be trying to add more of these videos in the future and kind of breaking down how I do things, giving the history behind the shots, and then also giving a quick tutorial at the end so that you guys can kind of follow along and use this in your journey of being a better filmmaker, artist, or a Blender creator. I'm going to try to do one video like this a week, and then we'll have one more fun video where we talk about gaming or, you know, all the other stuff that we're doing in this project. We have comics, we have a TV show, and we have a TCG. Please like, follow, comment, subscribe, all of that kind of stuff. I'm really bad at asking for that, so I'll have to like make a note of it in every video so that, you know, the algorithm will kind of like take these videos and hopefully show it to more people and help more people out. Thank you so much if you made it to the end of the video. I will see you next time, and in the comments let me know if there's any other tutorials you guys want to see, and I can go ahead and make you guys one. Anyway, see you next time. Peace.